My name's Emma Pritchard. I'm a reader at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies, and I've been part of CECAN on and off over the years. And for those who are new to CECAN, or are new to this format even, the CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus being food, energy, water, and the environment. And CECAN's been doing a lot of work around complex evaluation and making policy fit for purpose, essentially, and testing and pioneering different ways of doing that, evaluation approaches across UK government. But today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Luke Roberts do a webinar on, title is Beyond the Ticking Clock, A New Way to Time Systemic Change. Just say a few words about Luke. He's one of the few people that will be kind of in a prison, I was going to say prison cell, not prison cell, prison wing in a prison in the morning and then Google in the afternoon and then somehow writing academic books later. He's extremely busy. He's actively kind of a CECAN fellow, or not actively, he's just finished coming off a CECAN fellowship where he's been working on the idea of temporal complexity in complex systems and applying that to how complex evaluations might be done. He's also applying these, he's an applied social scientist in the real sense of the word, and he's applying a lot of these ideas to support communities using AI-driven work with Insightbox and, sort of in addition to his book, which I have here, but you won't be able to see well, Leading Schools and Sustaining Innovation. He's also writing 2 new books. So he's busy and it's great to have him here. And just before I hand over to Luke, just a word about the webinar setup. We've left chat on, but we'd appreciate comments to be put in the chat box and questions, which you can ask along the way in the Q&A. So if you can't see the Q&A, click on the More button and the Q&A facility will come up there. And if you could pose questions in there, that would really help to facilitate the discussion and actually kind of make the discussion a bit more easier to kind of talk through with each other. And I think that's everything from me. And I'll leave it over to you, Luke.
Fabulous. Thank you, Emma. Really appreciate the introduction, and it's great to have you as chair. I always enjoy our conversations, and there's always food for thought. So I'm looking forward to the exploration together and with everyone on the webinar. So, as Emma has said, today's topic is Beyond the Ticking Clock, a new way to time systemic change. And so just one of the warnings Emma gave me when thinking about this was the language of time is often quite clumsy, and you can spend a lot of time trying to define the thing you're trying to describe about time. So I just want you to be aware of that as we go through. So from my perspective, as a CECAN fellow, I really enjoyed the conversations that I was having with different fellows along the way. But time has always been something that I've been interested in because my background was in conflict and what happens when different conflicts happen in different times. So you have the same participants, but they've got their minds are on the future or on the past in a conflict situation. So as I started to think about like complex systems, I wasn't so concerned with the how. I started to become more concerned with, well, when does change happen? And when you're thinking about organizations, institutions, communities, the when becomes really important. So I'm really hoping to have an exploration with everyone today. So please do put comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A bit. But hopefully, like share your observations and reflections as we go, because I hate losing thoughts when I have them. But also we will use the chat for an activity later on as well. So with that in mind, the problem that I was really thinking through was, well, when we get the when wrong. was my starting point. So, in some of the work I've done in communities, when I used to work in local authority and used to support change there, I'd often hear, well, here we go again from communities, as if the thing that I thought was new wasn't new to them at all. So there was this kind of like change fatigue, change frustration, that happened because they had something that I didn't, which was memory. And then when we kind of think about having worked with like government departments, when change is dominated by like a central team, a central system, but tends to fail locally, what are they out of sync with between each other? Because for me, like you could work in an organization where everyone goes like, yeah, we're all doing the same thing at the same time. Well, some people are, and some people clearly aren't. So there are these tensions and frictions that rub up against each other. And then I think the bit that's become really interesting for me recently has been when we pretend we're changing or evaluating the system, but the system doesn't change at all. And so there's this performance of change that can occur. And so within the CECAN fellowship, I was really interested in kind of like unpicking, well, what does this mean when systems perform the act of changing, but don't actually change as well? So I hope that kind of starts to give you some sense of like the problem I'm hoping to play with over this talk as well. So from my perspective, one of the things that I was kind of interested in very early on was, well, what is the problem with most change models? And I think the problem with most change models, whether that's in the evaluation sector, systems practice, systems thinking, service design, organizational change is we tend to see time as linear. And by that, I mean the arrow of time is one directional. So it's only ever going to move from present to future. And I think lots of models have this kind of left to right mentality, which is like we're just going to go through these things and at the end we hit these outcomes benefits that we assume happened, but no one factored in time and different forms of time that may occur there as well, because we are so dominated by this linear idea. And I think, within my own kind of work, I go back to kind of Frederick Taylor and Taylorism and his work around the science of management and the production line. And the production line can only ever move forward because it's constantly producing. And so I think there is a worldview or a paradigm in which time gets locked into being this linear model because it's the way in which the production line thinks about things as well. So, but do please push back on me. So I think there are more forms of time than just these linear models of time as well. So from my experience, one of the things that I was interested in was kind of listening to people talk about systems. And when they talk about systems, they tend to touch on time, but not in an explicit way. So when you ask people about their lived experience in time, it becomes really interesting. So, because I've worked within education for over 20 years, one of the things that I find fascinating is the reoccurring pattern of time. So, when you talk to people who've been in education for several years, they tend to say, well, we've been here before and we're going to go around again with certain types of policy, initiative, or change. So you get a sense of a secular form of time happening in that system. That for people new, everything seems very exciting and very different. But actually, the longer you're there, the more things are given new labels for old ideas. So you get this reoccurring pattern of change that can happen in time. Whereas when I did some work in the NHS, it was really fascinating. They had this metaphor of time as a concertina. So time tends to expand when there's this push for much more localization, and then time tends to contract as there's this push for much more central, national driven strategy. And so people have this sense of being stretched and pulled and pushed within their time. So, and it was really just a fascinating metaphor. But one of the underlying things that really caught my attention was that although you're being stretched and pulled, the system isn't going anywhere. It's just this sense of change that's occurring without actual movement behind it, which I thought was a really fascinating metaphor. And then the third one has been working in some organizations in crisis where time feels like an explosion because everything is happening now, everything needs to be done. And I was working in one organization where the staff said to me, look, the senior leadership team are going to do this for about 2 years because that gets them over the crisis. And then the system will revert back to whatever it's doing before. And I say, oh, surely not, kind of thing. But they were absolutely right. And so you can have these moments where everything feels urgent in a system because you're in that kind of crisis management mode. And yet, actually, the system itself is repeatedly generating these forms of intense moments in time. So it's the ability to see that and step back. And then kind of the fourth one was from my work in the prison service about 10 years ago now. It was really interesting. The idea of time as we can wait you out. So whatever change you think you're going to enact within that system, the system knows that you probably don't have enough energy to fill the riverbed. And so therefore, no one needs to put much effort in because they know like you won't be here. And bear in mind, like the prison service has been around for 250 years. Sometimes when we're talking about 2 or 3 year initiatives, actually that is not long enough to even start to create a puddle in some of those systems, let alone full on change. So again, this metaphor of time is something that is dried out and energy goes in but then depletes very quickly. So these are just like four ways in which the lived experience of time can be different. So what I would like to ask those in our webinar today, just for a minute in the chat, what metaphor best captures how you feel time is in the system you work in at the moment? So it doesn't have to be any of those four. You may have a different metaphor, but do you have a metaphor to capture how time feels in the system you're working in? And I'll give a minute or two. Okay. So fleeting, not enough of it. Okay, concertina. Okay. So you've got quicksand, cycles and explosions, or cycles or explosions, maybe. Thank you, Lisa, for that one. Okay, time moves forward. Time is a wheel. Scarcity. All of them. Brilliant. Time is running out. Okay. I'm getting a strong sense that the hamster wheel might be winning here. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got time feels like an area, a garden, cyclical. Time is speed, so relative to energies. Thank you. Relative. Wonderful. So we've got some lovely metaphors of time happening there. Um, so let me just go back into where I'm supposed to be. You, we go. So from the metaphors that have been given, we're starting to feel like that subjectivity of time is happening, depending on what system you're in. And so that's really important to us because what I've been thinking about is those would be like different timescapes you've identified. So those timescapes I would call a particular chronotype. So a chronotype is a temporal rhythm or pace that is distinct for a social timescape. So depending on what institution, community, or sector you're in, you can feel the chronotype that you're in. So schools have a particular rhythm and a particular pace. Policy has a particular rhythm and a particular pace, and you can feel it as a subjective experience of the community, not just of the individual. So this is where you can exist in a particular chronotype. And my argument is that time is not linear, but that there is a temporal plurality, i.e., that there are multiple chronotypes existing in systems of interest. And so when we're thinking about this idea of these multiple chronotypes, a quick example would be like trying to get my son to school. I'm under like my time is like I need to get him there for 9 o'clock. The school expects him to be there at 9 o'clock as the institutional chronotype. And then because he has no concept of time, he's totally playful. He exists in a different chronotype altogether again. So we have three chronotypes at play within a temporal plurality at that moment in time. So this is where what becomes interesting from a systems perspective is that the system can hold or have multiple chronotypes. And sometimes these chronotypes are moving along in parallel to each other, but at other points in time, they are connected to each other or seeking connection. And I talk a bit more about this in my book around time and the relativity in systems. But the bit that was really interesting for me was when we're starting to think about change, does change also factor in whose chronotype are we in? And also, what are the other chronotypes that we may be trying to influence through the change as well? And so that's what the fellowship was really trying to kind of unpick a bit. And so I was thinking particularly about policymakers at the time. And so when thinking about policy, often the chronotypes is set by the policy maker. So I'm going to set a pace for change. And this pace is often done in a way that then starts to generate activity that is fundamentally trying to change the system of interest. And so we have this pacemaker that is trying to go right for them. We can speed up the pace or we can slow it down. But other chronotypes then exist within their own paces and their own rhythms as well. So this was a really interesting conversation with Nigel Gilbert, who said, Luke, time does not exist in the way you're talking about it, but it's about pace, that things go faster and slower. And I was kind of thinking, well, that's true if I'm in one chronotype, but if I exist in another chronotype to you, then your pace is relative to my speed. And so this is where we start to get that relativity of time kicking back in. But then that leads to something that I thought was really interesting in conversations with both Nigel and Emma, which was when we start to think about that kind of that pacing and who has the power of the pace, if you like, particularly in that policy setting, that can then lead to conflict. And so what I started to kind of think through was, what does a Chronos conflict look like? And so this is where a pace setter, like a policy, is put in place that dictates the time, and that time is dictated on like when the community will receive the benefit of change, etc. And that pace can dominate the subjective experience of different actors within the system. So like things have to be done fast or things may have to be done now. And so there is a real danger of the Chronos conflict, which is how the pace setter dominates either the past. And one of the best ways to dominate the past, arguably, is to just deny it exists. Like this intervention starts from now, and everything that happened before is irrelevant. And so we ignore other chronotypes that are seeking to experience the change, or those people who have to enact the change or evaluate the change. We can dominate the present by simply saying that right now is all that matters. And so, therefore, the experiences of those that may have been useful or done before, going back to my point about community fatigue earlier, that gets lost because, again, we're using that sense of urgency to say, like, this has to be done now, kind of thing. And finally, we can dominate the future by simply saying there is only one future, which is these outcomes, these benefits, these processes, and that's it. So there is no temporal diversity for other forms of time to exist because they are dominated by the pace setter. Hope that makes sense. Took me ages to think that one through. So, like a classic example of this is if I use this image on the next one, if you think about it in a kind of a temporal metaphor, if you like, if I'm a community seeking to enact change that's happening right now. So one thing that I'm really interested in is the growing levels of young people who are not entering the jobs market. So I think we're at almost like 1 million young people who are not in education, employment, or training. And so they are experiencing a pace of change. But then we may have policymakers who are saying, well, actually, we need to set up meetings, we need to do data, we need to do exploration, and then we're going to, commission people to enact the change or evaluate the change. So we now have three different chronotypes at play. And so in that example, it could be that the young people are the pace setters because actually they're the ones who are having to experience the change in the system at such a rapid speed, whereas the rest of the system is slower than the pace they're setting because of the needs that they have. Whereas often the inverse is true, which is actually there's a policy that needs to be enacted. We're going to put that into a community. We'll give them 18 months to set it up, but actually it takes 6 months to employ people, get everything right. But we'll ask the evaluator to evaluate those 12 months when it's actually happening. But it takes 3 months for them to get going. And so you can see here different chronotypes are at play between the policymakers, the evaluators, and the community. And so just as probably the intervention gets going in the community, the evaluation says, oh, there's some really interesting signs of change about to happen. But the policymaker goes, well, that we now need to move on because we've got a new cycle that's happening within our chronotype that is different to both the evaluators and the community. So this is where that temporal plurality kicks in, recognizing that people are existing in different times because of their memories, their experiences, and how they imagine the future to be as well. So that can create these chrono conflicts that can occur in systems. So that's what I was thinking about in terms of the way in which change is often the when, as opposed to sometimes the how or the what we need to do. And so recognizing these different types, these different chronotypes becomes important. And so our kind of next challenge then is, well, how do we potentially resolve chrono conflicts when they occur in systems? And so, dun, dun, dun. So I've kind of come up with three ways in which I think chrono conflicts can be resolved. But this is up for grabs and by no means the finished article. It's just the way I've been thinking about it in response to recognizing these chronotypes when they're in conflict. So the first one is hopefully the best one, which is you get synchronous emergence. So synchronous emergence is where the temporal states integrate into the pace setter's demands or the evaluator's focus and the internal chronotypes that become in sync within the system. And it occurs when a chrono conflict has been resolved and allowing the system reach its activation threshold, i.e. those overlapping chronotypes find a moment in time where they can be in sync. And that allows them to weave together into new forms of emergence that can transform and sustain the system going forward as well. So this is really about how chronotypes find that moment of negotiation between themselves that allows the system to create emergent properties for future trajectories in that system based off of new possibilities. So that sounds really exciting and really hopeful if we can get synchronized emergence happening in systems. And so I asked what Gemini or ChatGPT, whichever one it was, to give me an image of this. And this is what it came up with, like this weaving tapestry of time happening between the pace setters, the change agents, the communities, and the evaluators. So you can get new forms of trajectories happening in the future when we become in sync for moments in time and understand ourselves during the Chrono conflict. Whereas an alternative is asynchronized adaptation. And so this is where the pace setters' demands aren't met by the community, the evaluator, or the change agent in the system. And therefore, what you get is lag in the system. So people are moving at their different paces within their chronotypes, and yet there is an attempt to try and bridge these chronotypes in some way. So what you end up with, arguably, is rather than that emergent property of the system, you get small moments of change seeking to appease the pace setter. But for the pace setter, those changes come too late because they're in their past. For the change agent or the evaluator, they're noticing them happen now because they're collecting the evidence. But for the community, their chronotype is like these things are going to come, these things will happen in the future. So you get this misalignment of times that have chronotypes that are happening within the system. And so this you end up with small changes over time because of this. And so again, I tried to put this into an AI to see what the visualization was. And what you get is less trajectories of potential futures occurring because you have this lag in the system, which hinders the ability for the system to create emergence over time. And so, for those people experiencing this, it can be incredibly slow and incredibly frustrating, depending on which chronotype you're existing in. Because if you're looking for that evidence of policy change, pace setters would say, well, it didn't happen over the time we tried to get the intervention going. The evaluator said, well, actually, it may be starting to happen. Whereas for the community, they're saying, like, look, we're putting all of these things in place so they will happen in the future. So they're out of sync. So that's why they're asynchronized. And then the final one is basically when times don't work together or don't complement each other. I've kind of gone with this idea of this is where you get this discrete coupling of chronotypes. So at one level, the organization or community creates a visible layer of activity because the pressure from the pace setter is so high. So we can, satisfy your KPIs, your targets, your measures. But actually the chronotype itself, the community, the time you want change to occur does not happen at all, because it's a survival mechanism, because the people there know that the pace was too fast for them to be able to do anything. And therefore, it becomes a real challenge for people instigating change or evaluating change, because actually they're so disconnected, the chronotypes, that it can be an incredible moment of frustration because you can potentially see the potential, but actually it's not going to happen. And the timelines move off into their own chronotypes again. And so what you kind of get is the timelines feeding back on themselves. So like policymakers saying, well, that didn't work. Evaluators saying, well, if there was more time, we could have done better to understand what was going on there. And for communities, this is where that community fatigue comes back in. Well, look how much pressure we were under. And it's better to wait and hold back because that didn't feel like genuine change because our time wasn't recognized to make that change happen. So those are like three big concepts or ways of trying to describe what happens when times conflict with each other, chronotypes. So what I would like to do now is kind of ask, thinking about one of those, in the system you're working in at the moment, does any one of those feel relatable to you? Or is there another temporal state that you might want to throw out there as well? So we've got a short poll, hopefully, Gail, coming up. So thinking about a system you're working in at the moment, what kind of chrono resolution do you think might be happening in your system? Well, the numbers are going all over the place. Okay. Okay. I think we've had responses from most people. Okay. And so it looks like our top responses are the time of change feels misaligned across different parts of the system, has a whopping 50%. And then a further 24% are saying we constantly feel like we're being asked to move faster than feels possible as well. And 8% of people feel that they are moving at roughly the right pace. Okay, so we can see time is a really interesting issue to think about there. So thank you, Gail, for sorting that one out for us. Um, Brilliant. So happy to share the results of that, and I'll put that into the deck as well so people can see. Wonderful. Brilliant. So, what does this mean in the way we think about changing systems? So, my argument is systems change fails less often because of what we do and more often because of when we expect it to happen. So often we are, if we're the pace setters, we're putting so much pressure on the system on a different chronotype to match our pace that is not temporally possible, and therefore we need to think about recognizing that other communities and other stakeholders or actors in networks will have their own types of time and their own forms of change that occur as well. Um, and importantly, one of the things that came out for me in this kind of thought experiment was power in systems is not only about the power to impose or to defend or to opt out, but there's the power of setting the pace, this pace of change that we expect as well. And I don't think that's often recognized because of that linear model dominating that things that we don't recognize that time can happen in different ways within systems. And I think importantly for evaluations that ignore temporal plurality, we risk mistaking misalignment of chronotypes for failure, whereas actually we didn't find a way to resolve the chrono conflicts that were happening within the system. And so therefore the opportunities for emergent innovation are lost, not because the innovation wasn't good enough, because the when wasn't addressed appropriately or in the right time as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. And then my final kind of slide, I think, is, and I wanted to write this down just to get it absolutely right. So what I hope this has done is offer some insight into an experience many people have, but struggle to name because we don't often think about time as a challenge because it's hidden behind that linear model. And so this is why this idea of temporal plurality becomes so important. And I'm really clear that this isn't a finished piece of work. This is something that I'm experimenting, playing with to see how it resonates, to see how we notice patterns across systems where time shapes the quality of effort, where people feel traumatized or burnt out in their systems, or feel that the only option they have is compliance, or hopefully an optimistic change that's happening as well. And I think that, for me, it was really like quite fun to see like, would anyone show up at all to this session? And it seems like it really captured a lot of people's imagination, thinking about time and different ways of being in time as well. But I'm really open to like a genuine exploration across sectors, disciplines, and practices to explore how the timing of change affects what we actually want to change as well. And just a massive thank you to Emma as the chair, to Gail, who's behind the scenes supporting us, and also to Nigel, who helped me do some of this thinking as well, and to CECAN, just for allowing me to have this opportunity to present these ideas to people as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. That was brilliant. I mean, I'm so impressed that you managed to take what's what is in many ways abstract, but not make it abstract, make it really applicable and, something we can actually almost touch and feel. So yeah, you did really well in sort of translating some of those ideas directly into the complex evaluation space. We do have some questions. We've got plenty of time, which is really nice. So thanks for also for keeping to time.
I did my
Um,
best. I did my best.
if people have got questions, keep them coming in the Q&A, and you can also upvote the questions. Um, I have one my own, but I'll see how the time goes, and let's just go through them one by one, due fairness. Um, Nick Moore has a question in relation to your metaphors that you had earlier on. So, in time as an explosion, is crisis systemic? I'll say that again. In time as explosion, is crisis systemic?
Is crisis
I'm
systemic? I
glad I'm
think
glad they questions to you. And I've had a moment to think about them. And I still, but they're really good questions. So thanks to those who have put them in. They're great.
no, I think it's a great question. I think it can feel for those people in the system that time is there's a systemic crisis going on. Like, is the system in decline? Is the system failing in some way? And like one of the best examples has been for me working in schools in crisis because everyone becomes so reactionary. They don't think about like what was the cause of the things that happened or what do we need to do to prevent those things in the future. It's constantly like we have to deal with today, we have to get through today, and that's all that matters, and we'll deal with tomorrow when it comes. And the energy drain that has on a school community is immense, but that's probably true of multiple communities as well. So if you're living in these constant explosions of time, like there's an excitement, there's an energy, and but it also means that you just become reactive within that system. So when somebody else comes in and says, like, actually, we need to change this, it's really hard to get people out of the perceived chronotype that this is all that matters right now. And that there can be other ways of being in the world because of it. And so part of the conversation is like, how do you either slow them down? And how do you get them to step out of their chronotype and recognize, like, if you're in another chronotype where you could reflect, you might have a very different response to what feels like these constant explosions happening in your system.
Yeah, well done for that, because that's I mean, you're doing time, so you can handle tough questions. But thanks also for keeping the questions coming and for upvoting each other's questions too. I'll go straight to Leandro Garcia's question, and actually, it's got a quick follow-up if I've got time, and it's to do with stakeholders and having chronotypes. I'll read it out. So, in your experience, do stakeholders have more or less fixed chronotypes over time, or at least over the time of work on a given problem situation? Or do you think stakeholders frequently experience changes in their chronotypes? And maybe you can follow that up in relation to, in a given situation, are all perceptions of time valid, equally valid, or do some stakeholders suffer from almost like a time illusion? I can repeat the first one if or either part of it, but it's the issue of stakeholders having fixed times or changes in their chronotypes.
I think, again, so context matters is the first part to that. So, um, just to give an example, working in a community in London, really poor experiences of the educational system, the local authority, and for them, the pace of change was incredibly slow. So their rhythms of change, if you like, they're still within that chronotype. Like, when do things get better for us, if at all? That can feel incredibly slow. And so we can inject things like, there's a policy that says we can improve things around education, teenage pregnancy, gang violence. But often those are blips in their chronotype, as opposed to a fundamental shift in the chronotype to say this is how, through social mobility, better environment, higher level of services, quality, etc., the chronotype can shift because of it. So this is where that rhythm within your chronotype becomes important within that context. Whereas in a kind of a more successful form of systemic change, you may shift people out of, like I said earlier, going from that well, everything's in crisis to we can slow down. We can change the rhythm of the chronotype. And in changing the rhythm of the chronotype, that allows us to engage with more stakeholders. And therefore, we can synchronize with multiple stakeholders. And so we can share time together, and that allows us to be much more empathetic to people's needs, because we've taken out the urgency and the pace of change, which then brings about a new chronotype or new experiences of chronotypes because of that.
Yeah, great question and great response. With really good questions. We've got quite a few, so depending on how you feel, Luke, we can go through them quickly or give
Let's
comprehensive
go for it, Emma.
answers. I'm going with Yaz Romani's question because I think it will be applied to a lot of different scenarios. Are there scenarios where communities can actually feed into the pace, or feed into the pace set by the pace setters? For example, where communities desire to change quickly from central government, where they can actually feel that at the local level. So,
I think that's a, I think that's
so
an interesting one, and I
can
think
you
that
feed
kind of,
into the can you feed into the pace setters basically?
well, I think that's a question about participation and when that participation is allowed to happen. So, can we feed in? The answer would be often you can through surveys, questionnaires. But the danger is that are those symbolic forms of participation, or is there feedback that allows those participating to go, my voice has been heard? And because my voice has been heard, it changes the pace at which things are going to happen. So, does that mean, for example, things get faster? Or do things get slower? So just to give an example, because I live in Croydon, like Croydon for 15 years has been talking about building a shopping mall. And as someone in the community, it's been interesting watching this flap around for a decade and a half with the promise that we're going to go through a whole new consultation again to plan to build a shopping mall. Whereas I was in Shanghai in November, and everyone that I met was saying like 15 years ago, this was like, this town wasn't like this. But over 15 years, the pace of change has accelerated because their goal has been to raise the prosperity of the community. So again, depending on the pace setters' understanding of what change needs to happen, that allows community participation. So on one level, China doesn't allow communities to participate; they just get on with it. But the benefits emerge. Whereas we've had like constant democratic consultations in Croydon that have not changed anything at all. And so, who is setting the pace? Becomes really important. And so, therefore, stakeholder frustration and that ability to say, actually, how do I change the pace when it's not going to benefit me becomes a really important form of negotiation. But again, people, I would argue, this is where most models ignore time. And so it's just back to linear models of like, if we do this and this and this will happen. But the question is always, when will it happen? And that I think can be really frustrating and creates the chrono conflicts.
Mm. On that note of things kind of getting stuck, Hilary Kremen asks, when people sit down heavily, are they reclaiming power in the system where other forms of power are not available to them? And how does this form of power relate to other forms of power in the system? So it's like, it's almost like not, maybe they're blocking change, slowing change, like, but the phrase here is sit down heavily, which I like.
I think this kind of goes to, well, if I'm sitting down, I'm trying to change the pace. So for those people who may feel change is happening too fast or that their voices aren't being heard, if the pace setter is working on a 3-year policy cycle, for example, and we know that most forms of culture change, system change take between 5 and 7 years, sometimes the only way to stop that pace dominating you is to actually say, like, I'm going to sit down and you have to come to me. So I think you've got that challenge that can occur, which is how then do we recognize? We're back to how do we recognize each other's chronotypes at that point, because they might go, but we need this to happen now, and we're creating that sense of urgency. But taking the point, sitting down heavily, are we slowing down the pace setter, or are we just stuck with our now own chronotype and they're not recognizing that there needs to be a change of pace as well? And that's where, again, we go back to how do we negotiate in time?
Mm. Yeah, uh, are you doing okay? Because you're great at firing off the answers, and there's plenty of questions to come.
Okay.
Um, I want to move to a slightly different area, specifically responding to Rodrigo Busto Canseco, which is a great name. Um, that that person's question, which is around food, energy, and the environment. So thinking more specifically about kind of CECAN topics, but um, and maybe you can think with that, maybe you can't, and that's fine. But the question is, what do you think the food, energy, environment system chronotypes are? And do you think, is it, which one sets the pace, if any? I added, if any, by the way.
So we had food, energy, and
Yeah. So this is typically, I mean, it's maybe not an area you've worked directly in,
well,
but
I think, well, if we take going back to Donella Meadows' limits of growth type, context, which is when is food scarcity going to occur? And when is energy scarcity going to occur? So at the moment, when there's abundance, we don't necessarily recognize the pace in the same way. But as a chronotype starts to demonstrate a different form of rhythmic behavior, so food prices go up, energy prices go up, but they stay up and they keep going up. Then which one starts to set the pace is the ones that affect you most. And does then, so like a classic example would be like COVID was a pace setter. It set the pace globally for a moment in time because we had, economies, livelihoods, medicine, all of those things having to respond to something that was outside of their chronotypes. And it shook a lot of those things up. So again, I think when we're looking at these big sectoral ideas, the frustration might be like, why haven't we moved much more quickly to a green economy? Well, what actually sets the pace for the green economy? Like just simply saying like it's better than a fossilized fossil fuel economy. Well, that doesn't seem to be changing the pace at the same speed. So, are there other things that we could look at in terms of leveraging the chronotypes to go, if we want change to occur, what other forms of time need to happen or pluralities of time need to happen to allow that change to start to emerge?
yeah, that's really interesting and segues nicely into Kevin House's question around agency and Chronos. So, right, wondering about agency and Chronos, Luke, playing with the notion of one's natural Chronos state being in conflict with the collective Chronos cadence of the stakeholder group, even when not the pace setter. Also, thinking about Chronos sabotage, which I think is a great term. Also, thinking about Chronos sabotage and how there are agents who serve this function either consciously or unconsciously. I think Chronos sabotage needs to be looked into personally. But what's your view on agency and playing, the disjuncture between the natural Chronos state and the collective and chrono sabotage?
Yeah, well, I think that can. So, taking the first point about agency, the question for me is like if you've got, people or communities that are really slow to adapt to a change, and then you get someone who's like, we can do this, we're really like, we can move faster. You get that, dissonance that occurs between like action and need. And so for some people, it can be incredibly frustrating that the pace of change is so slow. But because it's a systemic pace as opposed to an individual pace, like I think there's the African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So this is where those tensions can sometimes play out, which is I can see where we need to be and how quickly we need to be there. And I think particularly for people in leadership positions, where you can see where you need to be, but also when you need to be there. But you've also got to then try and bring networks that have a collective subjective pace with you can be incredibly challenging. And I think that can then sometimes lead into the Chronos saboteur if you like, that if things aren't going fast enough, like how do I disrupt them or how do I undermine them is one part. But I also think um, within Chronos conflicts, it may not be sabotage. It can just simply be a defense mechanism to slow everything down because actually trust in change is really hard and trusting that things will change over time to get better can be incredibly difficult when you've had experiences of change failure in the past. And that goes back to my circular time, which is, oh, I've been through this before. Do I want to risk the currency of trust again to allow to trust someone that this could happen, knowing from my previous experience, this isn't. And this is why I think we have to be kind of really respectful to history and memory as
Mm.
well. That's why the chronotype exists because people have experiences that we may not recognize or validate. So that saboteur may have been through that cycle 4 times before. And so what is going to be different for them next time? So recognizing they exist in their time in that chronotype and that the institution might exist in that when you've had, what was it, in education, we've had something like 9 educational ministers in 10 years. Like, whose policy are you going to follow? So it might just be simply better to sit within your chronotype and go, actually, let's wait and see if they actually do mean the change they're going to be, which can be incredibly frustrating for those policymakers and those people wanting to evaluate change.
Yeah, that was great. Um, and it's as if you're sort of preempting some of the questions. What about this issue of past and memory? Can read out Sarah Jones's question, which is I'm struck by the synergy of this with Dr. Martin Luther King and his statement about time that time is neutral and can be used either destructively or constructively. Um, and I've been noodling on the memory of a system, the stories which might not be true but remain important to a system. I wonder if there is a chronotype around past time which can be used to create or destroy change and outcomes now and in the future, which is really nice. I like the idea or the image of this embedded system memory that can be used to create or destroy change now and in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think Martin Luther King was a system thinker and just hasn't been credited with being that, to be honest. Like, he has amazing quotes and he instigated change as well across systems. So I think this is where recognizing the chronotypes becomes really important and the power the chronotypes have. And one of those powers is the power not to engage. And so if the memories that we have of the past are traumatic or full of conflict and hurt, again, I go back to my point about, well, what's the currency of trust that allows us to align in time? And so this is where I think we have these kind of like these, potential bubbles of time where we can allow people to have different experiences and play in ways that often their own chronotype doesn't allow them to. And so when we're thinking about how power gets wielded in pace setters, often it's through the sense of urgency, which denies memory, disregards history. And so therefore you build up that threshold of defensiveness that can occur because I remember what it was like when we did this. And I think one of the things that I learned working with prison officers was actually they really do want change because some of their systems are incredibly archaic and need to just go. But if you say to them, we're going to be really innovative, you're giving them hope for the future. And their experience of the future is often policies get withdrawn, funding gets cut, we get we get loss of recognition as a service. So they become less and less interested in the future and more interested in the present, which is how do I survive today? Because the memories of the past are too painful to explore, and the present is the safest place to be. So I think it is really about recognizing that systems have patterns of behavior. As humans, we have memories that we'd also call patterns of behavior.
Yeah, great response. And yeah, Rodrigo's responded to that saying that was a really good question, and the concept of time memory feels really relevant when talking about time. And you just said it as well, that humans have memory and humans are part of the system, so inevitably that becomes part of it. Um, we've got one last question. You're doing great because these are like taking you all over the chronotypes and chronospheres. Um, but this one's I kind of wanted to have it earlier on, but I think having it last also is good. But it's possibly one of the more abstract, and it's about energy basically and energy discrepancies. And the reason I think it's quite the question is basically how do you think about energy discrepancies in relation to chronic conflicts? I like it because it brings in the idea of energy and time together, which are obviously very big topics in complex systems. I can read it out again because how do you think about energy discrepancies in relation to chrono conflicts?
So I'm a big fan of social systems have social energy. And so our relationships have energy moving between us, and that can be in the forms of information, attention, or money. And so often within chronotypes, they have their own energy that goes along with that, which is like, where do we put our attention? Do we put our attention in the past because we remember these things that happened? Do we put our attention in the present because the present really matters? Or do we put our attention in the future as well? So we have the ability to imagine. And so I think this idea, this is what I meant by the activation threshold, which is if the system does not have enough energy, then it will decouple from various chronotypes because it's conserved. One chronotype is conserving energy against, for example, the pace setter or the evaluators. Whereas if we have this lag, it means there's not enough energy in the system for the chronotypes to come together to activate. So you've got one system, one chronotype that has so much energy or privilege of energy in it that it allows it to move faster and set the pace. Whereas the lag also shows that discrepancy in energy as well. Whereas if we get things right and we synchronize, that means that our energy levels are coming together. And just to give an example, I remember years ago doing an inset with teachers and recognizing some of them were in the room, but were thinking about the events that had happened before they got in the room. Some of them were wanting this to really hurry up because they had other things to do. And so I was like, right, how do I get them to be present in this moment in time? And I think that is often the challenge we face in systems change, which is people's energies are going into different directions. And so the skill of evaluation systems change is to create the conditions where we can activate our energies in a way that's synchronized and allow new forms of innovation to occur.
Thanks. That was actually, I should have said the name, Tim Logan's question. We have 3 minutes, but we are near the end. But a couple of questions have come in very quickly, but
Okay.
well, comments. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. But people are loving it. So the question is from Martin Reynolds is like, how do you view this work as being a contribution to developmental evaluation lineage? Or more associated with or relevant to the mundane business as usual types of intervention. And Sarah Jones added to that, it's like, you know, and how do you see it almost contributing to learning systems models, which can be alongside evaluation? So I guess we're going into a space of models of evaluation. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I think business as usual evaluation, as I said, is dominated by its linear model. And I think the danger of that for me, as someone interested in complexity, is that it's reductionist, which so it doesn't acknowledge diversity or plurality of times. And so therefore we may not see the true benefits of systems change because those models don't allow it to occur. So I hope it does contribute to developmental evaluation in that way, which is saying like, do we recognize that time is an important part of the variety that occurs in systems and people's experiences of that time also really matters to when the change is going to happen. So I think that's really important to me.
Yeah, nicely responded to. And yeah, sorry to thrown in a last one after the final one. Um, it is near to time now, so we will bring it to a close. But I can really see your work kind of advance complex evaluation, even explicitly in the theory of change. We can imagine identifying not just actors and relations, but the pace setters, the different chronotypes in the system, the ones that kind of inhibit or facilitate transformation. So well done for making a great webinar today. And if you all go to your, oh, you can't react, can you? Because you're on, oh, that's a shame. But just a round of applause to you, Luke. And yeah, thanks also to Gail for organising it behind the scenes as well. Thanks
Thank you.
everyone for attending, and all to the people who are going to be listening on recording again. It's a fascinating topic. Well done.
Thank you.